Okay, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. Welcome everyone to this Veeam and Micro Focus webinar on the ultimate in GroupWise protection. My name is Q Mangus. I'm a Solution Marketing Manager here at Micro Focus. And today we're joined by Joe Martin, who's the Senior System Engineer for Veeam Software. And we're going to be talking about some solutions that Veeam has and a solution that Micro Focus has for protecting your GroupWise solution and backing that up. A few things just to begin with before we turn the time over to Joe is if you have any questions, feel free to put those through in the question panel there in the GoTo webinar, and we will answer those as we're going through. We'll also have time at the end for a question and answer session. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so you will receive an email shortly after this webinar, maybe on Friday or Monday, with the webinar recording and other resources as well. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for your interest in this webinar. We have some great information for you today. I hope you can benefit from it. So we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Joe and let him go through his portion, and then I'll take over in a little bit. So once again, thanks everyone, and thanks Joe for being here.
Sure. Thank you very much, Q. Appreciate the opportunity. So yes, as Q mentioned, I'm Joe Martin. A lot of you that have joined the webinar today may be familiar with me. I mean, I'm formerly with Novell and Micro Focus, heavily participated in the NGW list and other various online communities. And so with that GroupWise background, I've kind of had an eye to that since coming to Veeam and other Micro Focus products as well. And I thought, this is a great opportunity to really discuss what Veeam can do. Because I have found that a lot of times in that we'll say former Novell base, that portion of the Micro Focus environment, people don't always think about us, hey, Veeam is all about Microsoft. And so today is really to talk about some of the things that we do and how our combination with some of the solutions directly from Micro Focus really give you just some awesome opportunities to protect your GroupWise environments. So a little bit about us real quick for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with Veeam. So we got our start in 2006 and actually shipped our first paid product a couple years after that, 2008. So during that time, we've had a very rapid rise here. You can see some of the latest statistics. These are accurate actually as of the end of Q3. So as of the end of September, we've got now nearly 270,000 customers. Over 15 million virtual machines are protected worldwide by Veeam. You can see a lot of the Global 2000 and Fortune 500 use us. And the reason I like to talk about that, even though the focus today is going to be on the technology side, is that it tells a little bit about how solid Veeam's technology is versus some of the competition that's out there. Just because, what I like to say is you wouldn't have that many people switching to us in such a short amount of time, since 2008, so 9 years, unless the solution was pretty rock solid. That's a point, in fact, I made earlier this year. If any of you have joined our schools, you may be familiar with the Technology Transfer Partner Program, or TTP. And with the TTP, I presented earlier this year in Provo. And, the question was, well, we don't buy solutions just because everybody else is using it. And I said, I understand that and fully not expecting that. But again, in our case, it's more along the lines of speaking a lot about the technology. So with that being said, let's talk about the technology. And, an interesting thing about us is when we got our start back in 06 and we shipped the first version of Veeam Backup and Replication a couple of years later, our focus was specifically on virtual environments, VMware, later on Hyper-V as well. And today we've moved to, physical environments, cloud-based solutions. But if you look up that core virtualization solution, back in 2008, we were actually very unique in saying you install a single solution, and that gives you the ability to not just back up your environment, but actually replicate and have extra copies of your virtual machines in an alternate site that are completely ready to go at a moment's notice, so that you don't have to kick off restores first. So it's really interesting that we offer, this functionality without any, extra add-ons. It's just there. It's a matter of using everything. And what actually allows this is the architecture that we have in the environment. So you can see here a high-level overview of what goes on in a Veeam environment, where basically when we're talking virtual environments, that we will go ahead and back up your VMs regardless of what the underlying storage is. So it doesn't matter who you have it from, though we have some specific integrations with certain vendors. That is all read through a data mover we call our source proxy. We land our backups onto disk, which from there can either go to more disk that you maintain, it could go to cloud, it can go to tape, whatever, and then you see some replication. So you see all this coming together. Again, replication is not being marketed as something separate. We just have the dashed line kind of showing that it's going out to a remote site, that all in one solution. And even when we come to looking at some specific applications that we support, things like, say, SQL Server, we've got the ability to go ahead and do application-aware backups and item-level recoveries without ever having to install agents or purchase agents, purchase options, anything like that. So it really makes it nice, not just from a technology standpoint, but really from a license standpoint. Very simple. You don't have to worry about, well, I didn't buy this option, I didn't buy that option. You know, I'm not licensed for enough slots in my tape library. Oh, I need to back up more capacity. None of that matters. You know, so we make it very simple. And so because of this architecture of doing everything at the VM level, when we talk about virtualization, then that means too, it doesn't matter what the underlying OS is. So it makes it very easy to back up, you know, OES, SUSE Linux, just as we would back up, you know, in a flavor of Windows that you might have in the environment. So it's a very robust architecture, but at the same time allows everything to be as simple as you might need it. But what I like to say is that, you know, backup really isn't all that difficult. I mean, if you want to back up your environment, I could probably write a script that's going to clone VMs. How easily are we going to get data back in that scenario? And that's one of the areas where we shine. I mean, I go into a little bit of detail about how we do backups, but really the recovery options is what's, you know, really going to set us apart. And you can see this chart here with our latest version that we've got 57 different ways to restore. So I like to call this our periodic table of restore elements. It's a nice little bit of eye candy, and you know, it may be a little bit difficult for some of you to see every individual item, but the point is we have a lot of flexibility, and that's what really lends a Veeam environment to be used so that you can get your production environments restored very quickly. Because at the end of the day, you know, why restore a whole VM if all that happened was that you need to recover maybe a couple of emails in someone's GroupWise mailbox. So let's just restore the minimal amount of data that we need. And really, not only does the growth we have in customers speak to this, but also just the various awards. And I'm not going to cover, you know, these individual logos that are on here, but you can see, you know, we've won a number of awards dating back to 2010 even, and I think we may even have some older ones, to be honest. I'd have to go back and take a look, but this is at least what I put together to show various awards through the years, all the way to this year in 2017 earning awards. We continue to add more and more to our portfolio here. So it really shows the industry recognizing us in addition to all the different customers that have leveraged us. But, you know, how does that help a Micro Focus environment? So let's really talk about that and go into a little more details on what everyone's using now that we've done a little bit of high-level overview. So one thing I'm going to talk about before we get to GroupWise is let's talk NSS. So it's interesting, when I started here, I knew we had NSS support. I knew that had been added in 2013. When I came here, I said, hey, you know, OES 2015 is out. Can we get enhancements? And through a lot of discussions I had internally, getting Veeam to actually work with product management on the Micro Focus side, working with engineering on the Micro Focus side, we've gone and enhanced our NSS support specifically around restoring files. Because keep in mind, it's that image level backup. We'll back up anything. You could have an OS2 VM out there. We'll back that up. Doesn't matter what it is, but how easily can you restore some of those items? So when we released version 9.5 about a year ago or so, we added support for OES 2015. And then earlier this year, when we released our first update for 9.5, we enhanced it again just because there was the new trustee index feature that was added to OES 2015 SP1 that required some specific support. And you can see a URL here with more information that I'll actually send you to a Cool Solutions article I wrote to announce that. Because it is huge that, you know, we're probably one of the only, or at least one of very few, you know, major backup vendors. So I'm not talking, you know, maybe small niche players, but as far as major backup vendors in the whole world here that have added support for NSS and continue to update that. And I'm already actually getting some information about OES 2018, so I can begin driving some of those conversations as well. And that, of course, is just one small piece of a Micro Focus environment. So we've got the ability to get eDirectory cleanly backed up using some scripts. We could also make sure we get NSS trustees restored properly using a little bit of scripting, and I can share some sample scripts I've written. And then, earlier I gave the example of SQL Server. Well, think about that. If you're ZenWorks or Filer or Vibe, you're able to go ahead and restore those databases if something happens very easily using us. And again, you don't need any kind of specific database option. We've even got Oracle support out there for larger environments. So I know large ZenWorks environments, and I forget the threshold it needs to be where it goes from SQL to Oracle. But if you're a really large ZenWorks environment and you're using Oracle as a database, again, application or backups, and in that case, we're talking Oracle on either Linux or Windows. And the same thing for Vibe, which has that. And you can see notes about Filer and iPrint. Since we are focusing on virtualization, that's a great solution for any kind of appliance in order to back it up. And we can back up physical servers too. Again, I mentioned that earlier, so we can handle physical Windows and Linux. So there's definitely a lot more that we do than just protecting a Microsoft environment. But what are we all here today for? And that's GroupWise. So let's talk about what you can do natively with us, and then in a couple of minutes, Q is actually going to go into some of the very GroupWise specific solutions that Micro Focus has for data protection and disaster recovery of GroupWise. But if we look at what we can do natively, first of all, our application-aware image processing is a solution that allows us to interact with any of the guest VMs to get clean application-consistent backups. Now, since we don't have native hooks into GroupWise itself, what we can do are leverage scripts that basically allow you to stop the post office, take a VMware snapshot, and then start the post office. So do you have an outage? Potentially, but probably under 30 seconds, maybe even much less than that. So clients should automatically resume. But again, if you can't go with even that small of an outage, what Q is going to talk about is going to be perfect for you. But it's very easy to go ahead and do that. And you can see here where I've specified some Linux scripts in my environment here. That's actually a screenshot out of my home lab. If you're running GroupWise on Windows, it's a similar thing. It's just services being stopped, obviously, in that case. So maybe it's a PowerShell script that you might do. So once we've got a clean backup of GroupWise, then you have a few different options for restoring data. So if ultimately you're trying to get a whole post office back, or even if it's just a user maybe deleted a few items. So one option is to use our file level recovery feature to basically restore the post office, but maybe to an alternate area, because it's not a full disaster. It's again a case where just a couple items need to be restored. Since you can define a restore area within a GroupWise system, just restore the post office to that restore area, and that way users can go in their client, say file, open backup, go to that restore area, and find those items that they need to get. Obviously, you need to have enough space available for the whole PO, but it's an option that you can do with us. Another thing, and you're going to see this in action in a moment here, is instant VM recovery, which is a really, really awesome way of getting data back. So if we look at what its main use is, I've got a VM that has failed me. It's a really large VM. Maybe it would take a few hours to restore it. Rather than sitting here and waiting on users being down, what we can do with instant VM recovery is actually run the virtual machine directly from whatever your backup repository is. So that disk-based repository where the backups initially land, doesn't matter if it's a NAS appliance, a Windows server, a Linux server, a deduplication appliance, we will run the VM directly from there. So in that scenario, you connect it to production, and you go ahead and have your, have your users connect in, and they just keep using the system, whatever it might be. And then as needed, you can go ahead and migrate that back to production. And we actually, like in VMware, for instance, use storage vMotion under the hood so that we consolidate all those changes and get everything restored back to production. So really the only downside there is it may be a little slower because your backup repository is not as fast as your production storage. But the upside is that users are back up and running in a matter of a few minutes versus maybe a few hours. So you're going to see that in a second, though, because when we talk about GroupWise, again, the case where the user needs a few items back, rather than restoring the whole PO, now an interesting thing we can do is let's still leverage instant VM recovery, even though the production VM is running. The key here is don't connect it to the production network. So once it's booted, because you'll see in the wizard where we just say don't connect it to any network. Once it's booted, we can then connect it to an isolated network, then just boot a little Windows VM in that same network that's got the GroupWise client on it. You can get those items, archive them, copy them off the VM, unarchive them back into production. A few steps to go through, but the point is, out of the box, there's a way to be able to get your GroupWise data restored. And then the other thing is going to be full VM restore. So in that case, you have lost everything. You need to just get it up and running right away. So we just restore the entire virtual machine. So you've got a few different things that you can potentially do. All right, so let me, we'll do one more slide here though, because I want to talk a little bit about, another way of thinking about things. We'll kick off part of this demo and then we'll let Q kind of take over while the virtual machine boots, just as I do not have a very speedy lab by any means. But if you do want to take it a step further beyond what Veeam has, and this is sort of one of the reasons too of going in together and co-presenting this webinar, is that directly from Micro Focus, thanks to their acquisition of Guava, you've got a solution directly from Micro Focus now that does have GroupWise specific integration, and that's GroupWise Disaster Recovery, which many of you may know by its former name of Reload. And so when you take a look at this, if you combine Veeam with GroupWise Disaster Recovery, it's almost like looking at a best of breed approach. Instead of trying to maybe find a backup vendor that says we natively can do all of this, that we can natively back up virtual machines and natively do tape and natively do GroupWise, knowing that maybe the GroupWise piece is nice, but the other parts aren't quite as good, and knowing that the bulk of your environment, there's a lot of other VMs running, GroupWise is just one small piece. Instead, you can say, you know what, I'll go with Veeam since they're the best for protecting my virtual environment as a whole, and then I will augment that by using GroupWise Disaster Recovery for the GroupWise part. So even though you're buying two solutions, at the end of the day, you're actually getting much better functionality than trying to find someone that can maybe do that all in one. So with that, I will pause and let me minimize this and let me do a quick demo here. By the way, as I fire this up, Q, have we received any questions yet? So KVM itself right now, no. Now what I can share is that one particular hyperconverged platform that's out there is Nutanix. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with it. Nutanix supports 3 hypervisors. So they support VMware and Hyper-V. They also support Acropolis, which is their flavor of KVM. So it's basically they've forked KVM and added some additional APIs that are specific to Nutanix. And we have announced support for that. Now, in that case, we've got the advantage of being able to leverage Nutanix's APIs, which means that there's a little bit less development effort on our part, so we can come to market sooner. But that still opens the door to potentially moving beyond just that kind of specialized version, if you will, of KVM to maybe something broader. But at the current time, no, KVM, like native KVM, if you will, is not supported. But you know what, I will add one thing, even though it's not, since I mentioned we have support for physical servers, that's done through an agent. You could take our agent-based approach, which is install Windows agents and Linux agents into the virtual machines in a KVM environment and just back up the VMs that way. And there is a way to do central management. So if you'd like to talk about that, we could always take that question offline and go into details on how that solution would work. Sure. So we can replicate to the cloud if you use a managed cloud provider, we'll say. So not necessarily one of the public hyperscale solutions like Azure or AWS, but we now have, I believe the count is just shy of, I want to say 17,000 or 18,000 Veeam cloud providers globally. And so if you want to replicate to the cloud or even just get backups offsite for that matter, all of that's available using a Veeam cloud provider. If you want to use the public cloud, there are some things that are in the works. As for instance, VMware recently announced the ability to run VMware Cloud on AWS. And I know we have support coming in our next update to at least back up those VMs. But at the end of the day, since it is essentially the ESXi hypervisor running inside of AWS. Theoretically, you should be able to do replication with that once that's fully built out. Another option for Azure is I recently learned that Microsoft supports nested Hyper-V. So if you're a Hyper-V environment, you could potentially replicate to Azure using nested Hyper-V. So a couple of options kind of in the works, but if you want full support, if you will, for replication and not be limited on hypervisors and be able to use any provider, then I'd say let's get you in touch with a Veeam managed cloud provider. All right. Cool. All right. Thank you, Q. So let me just do a real quick firing off of an instant VM recovery job, and then once this is running, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Q. But you can see here, this is a backup job, by the way. This backs up 2 OES VMs. So these are both OES 2015. One is a file server. The other one is running GroupWise 2014. And so, let's say I do need to restore a particular item. You can see there's a lot of different other restore options, but we're going to focus on instant VM recovery. And it's a pretty simple wizard to do this. So when it first comes up, it says, okay, here's all these restore points that are out there. And what a restore point is every time we run a backup and we create backup files, that's a restore point. So we've got all these out there. You can see how many that I configure. Once those are listed, I can just pick where I need to restore this. So the common thing would be the most recent backup, but if you need to view the environment as how it looks, 2 weeks ago or a month ago or whatever, I could always pick, an older restore point. But I'm going to do a new restore point. And because production actually is running and I'm not shutting down the production VM, I'm going to say let's do it to a different location. Ultimately, because my lab consists of one host, it's still going to go to the same location, but what I'm going to do is rename this VM. So that way it can be running at the same time as the other one. So I will just put for the VM name, let's say dash instant VM recovery as the name. And I'm just going to pick, particular resource pool. That's the resource pool I use for all my other VMs. And what happens is this process goes, by the way, is we basically present an NFS data store to VMware so that any updates that need to happen, because obviously when you boot a VM, there's writes that occur. Those right now are going to come to the Veeam server. If I wanted to, I could check that box and actually say send those writes to a specific data store. But right now we'll let those come to the Veeam server. And I'm not going to connect it to the network, but I am going to go ahead and power it on. And just to show that this is firing off, so let me do one more thing here. And then I'll turn it over to Q because I don't think everybody wants to just sit here and watch paint dry as a virtual machine boots. But I am logged in to my virtual center that I've got. And as activity starts going off here on the left side of the screen, you will see things start to happen on the right side. So it's a way to kind of monitor. So you can see on the left where from the Veeam perspective, we say we're publishing the VM. And now you can see within the vSphere client that the machine has been registered. And we are reconfiguring, so we need to change some settings as we do it. I'm going to refresh, by the way, because this HTML5 interface, one thing it doesn't do is as a VM pops up, it doesn't update the list. Now it does. Now notice it says there's a MAC conflict, and it makes sense. This is an exact copy of the other VM, even the same MAC address. Normally not a problem if it's a case where you've had a failure. In this case, 2 machines are coming up. At least they're not plugged into the same network. I'm just going to say reset the status to green. There's actually a blog posting that one of our architects over in Europe wrote on how to kind of get around that and just help tell VMware, don't tell me when I have a VM MAC conflict. I know that's going to happen during instant VM recovery. I don't really care. But you can see here, there's that VM now. It looks like just another VM in the environment. And you can see the last message here, powering on the virtual machine. And if I go take a look at the console, I should see this guy is booting up. Now it's going to take him a few minutes, so I'll just let this thing chug away. And what I will do, Q, is let me get PowerPoint back up, and I will turn this over to you. Let me, there we go.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. Great information so far. So, yeah, I'm excited to present to you some of the stuff that we have to give you, bigger or better protection with GroupWise as well, and how they work hand in hand with Veeam. So let's touch a little bit about, we know that an email disruption, email is important. Oh, let's get you there. Okay, so email is important, right? Your organization uses it. it's not going away. It's something that's essential to your business processes. It's something that you have to have. And so if there's an email disruption, if your email system goes down and you don't have access to it, it can cost your organization a lot of money. So here's just a few examples that we found of just a small organization or of 250 users and what it would cost them if their email system went down. Based on an average employee hourly cost of $30 per hour per employee. I probably am preaching to the choir here because we all know that you have to be up and running, both for cost perspective and just for job satisfaction and productivity. So you need to make sure that you have a plan in place, right? So do you have a plan, or is it something like this Dilbert cartoon, right? That's your disaster recovery plan. Run around yelling help, right? And so what's important is if you've tested that plan, and if everyone's trained on that plan, and will you be able to provide communication during a crisis? And so obviously backup and disaster recovery, there's a lot of reasons why you should have it, but one of them would be in the case of a disaster. And so you need to be able to have a plan and have software that helps validate that plan. So let's talk about the solution that we offer with Micro Focus. And as Joe talked about, that the recent acquisition of Guava gives us a great solution now. From the same people that provide you with GroupWise, you have one solution to be able to have disaster recovery and backups for GroupWise for that great email solution. You have hot backups. I'm going to talk about that. You have immediate recovery and full restoration. There's failover for GroupWise. So if your GroupWise system goes down, say there's a hardware failure or a disaster or anything that causes your GroupWise system to go down, GroupWise Disaster Recovery, formerly known as Reload, can actually serve as your GroupWise system. You won't go down because it can immediately fail over and act as GroupWise. So let me touch on a little bit more about some of the things. So when it comes to, let's see, did I go one too many? Okay, no, I'm good. Sorry, I thought I clicked twice. What's great with GroupWise Disaster Recovery is that the restoration is quick. You can get items back into GroupWise quickly and easily. You have the ability to restore single messages, multiple messages, entire address books, and entire mailboxes. And one feature in GroupWise Disaster Recovery is this, what we call auto reload, where a user can restore their own messages, either a single or multiple messages. They don't have to go to IT to ask for that help. That's one other thing that's going to make it easier for you to run your GroupWise system, is you're not going to have to be worrying about your users calling you, asking you for that single lost email that they may have accidentally deleted. Some other things too that's great, and we love to talk about this, it's the push button disaster recovery. You click and you're in disaster recovery mode. All you have to do is switch the DNSA record for the post office or domain, and now you're in using Reload, or GroupWise Disaster Recovery powered by Reload, as your GroupWise system. Another thing too is you can access backups. You don't have to have combined backups. You select a backup, wait about a minute, and you're set. So getting to your backups are easy with that idea of hot backups, being able to have complementing what Veeam has by being able to have those backups that are readily available and that are much more granular when it comes to GroupWise itself. Let's talk a little bit about, oops, I hit one too many. Let's talk a little bit about Smart Purge integration. This is really important because what happens with GroupWise Disaster Recovery and GroupWise is that items, because of this integration, everything's backed up. You're not going to lose anything when it comes to GroupWise. Meaning, and what that means is that items can't be purged until they're backed up, and nothing can be purged from the backup. So you can be rest assured that in your GroupWise Disaster Recovery backup, everything's in there, and that things can't be taken off of the GroupWise server until they're backed up. Also, backup speeds are extremely fast. Even though every backup is equivalent to the full backup of the post office, only about 4 to 12% of the PO is replicated and stored each day. So it looks like a full backup, but only that percentage of it is replicated and stored each day. What's also great too is on disk it looks just like a GroupWise post office, and that's why you can fail over to that, and why it's easy to get that back. And of course, as we talked about, being able to verify your plan is important, and so these backups that are on GroupWise Disaster Recovery are immediately usable for data restore or disaster recovery. So every time you're testing a backup, you're checking a backup, you're restoring a message, you're testing your backup disaster recovery, your backup and disaster recovery with GroupWise Disaster Recovery. Some other things too is it integrates directly with the GroupWise client. You don't have to install anything. There's no rights to assign. It works, like we like to say, hand in glove with GroupWise. We've had such a close-knit partnership when it was Guava and GroupWise that we worked hand in hand with GroupWise engineers. And now that we're one company, that will continue as one company. And it, of course, integrates with the GroupWise restore area. And like we talked about, those backup and push button disaster recovery, even for GroupWise domains. Some other things too that I want to talk about is this intraday backups, right? You can set and have concurrent backups. You can set how often you want these backups to happen. Some organizations want to have a nightly backup. Some want to have multiple backups per day. You can do that. You can set it up how you want it to be with GroupWise Disaster Recovery. So if you want to have multiple backups per day, you can. And of course, with that 4 to 12% of PO a day stored on disk, it's not that difficult to do. And as an example here, 14 days of the backup is about 2.5 times the post office size. So the backup sizes aren't very large. And of course, you have that ability to get to those and have those intraday backups, giving you that full and immediate hot backups, like we like to call that. One other thing too that we like to talk about as well is this ability to migrate. So if you're ever migrating your hardware or your platform or maybe a newly repaired GroupWise system, you can migrate easily. So all you have to do is you use reload to back everything up, make sure you have the most recent backup, take your GroupWise system down, put it onto that new hardware if you're doing it, or onto that new platform, or if you have a new GroupWise system that's been repaired because the other one went down. Now you spin up that new GroupWise system, use reload to push and back everything back up, or restore everything back into GroupWise, and now you're running. Nothing's been lost. That's another great use case for using GroupWise Disaster Recovery. And then when we were talking about that immediate failover, so once again, if your GroupWise system goes down, you can use GroupWise Disaster Recovery as your GroupWise system. And you can actually use that for up to 2 weeks on the Reload system, on the GroupWise Disaster Recovery powered by Reload system. So hopefully your recovery time is less than that. We haven't had a customer that's ever met that 2-week time, but just know that that's there and you can use that. And then of course, when you do get your GroupWise system back up, you can restore everything from GroupWise Disaster Recovery back into the GroupWise live system. And of course, one thing too that I want to touch on is this ability to have replication of your data, each backup, to up to 3 locations. You can have an on-site location, an off-site location, and the cloud. And that gives you peace of mind, right? Knowing that you can have something that's in the cloud, if you'd like, or another off-site location or an on-site location. You have that ability to have that true disaster recovery because it's going to be readily available and in a location that's strategic. There's another great feature too, is this idea of freezing backups for later use. So if you have a backup that you know that you need to go back and reference, or you need to use at some other time, you can go easily into the solution and quickly and easily freeze that backup and have that so that it will not be purged until you unfreeze it, so that you can always go back and use that one. And of course, GroupWise Disaster Recovery has great reporting features to be able to see what's happening in your backup and how that's going. So another couple of things here is just kind of the way it works is you can put it on a SLES server or Windows server. The backups of the GroupWise post offices and domains can work on either one. There's also a recovery agent that's optional that's for SLES servers only. And I'd encourage everybody on this call. There's a great webinar. We're not going to get into that as much, and I will make sure to send this out to everybody where we have a great, it's about a 30-minute demo of everything that I've talked about. On how GroupWise Disaster Recovery can help you and do everything that I've shown you or I've talked about. It's shown on that webinar, and I'll make sure to give everybody that resource as well. So just to sum up, and one thing I want to make mention of is that there is a demo, so you can go out and see how all this works if you go to reloaddemo.guava.com:5555. I'll make sure to include that in the email that we're sending as well. But I would encourage you to go out there and check that out, see how it works on that demo server, get a view of how push-button disaster recovery works, and get that at-a-glance monitoring. And then, like I said, anytime you restore an email using GroupWise Disaster Recovery, you're really validating your disaster recovery plan. You're seeing that GroupWise Disaster Recovery truly can meet your needs to be able to have that granular backup and disaster recovery. I just want to show really quick. Here's just a screenshot of how easy it is to turn on disaster recovery. You just push that button, right? You do that click. You have disaster recovery mode running. You simply switch that DNS record, and now you can run GroupWise on reload. So that's it for my part of GroupWise Disaster Recovery. Hope you can see how powerful this solution is for being able to fail over and have disaster recovery and backup for your GroupWise system. Go ahead and give that back to Joe. He has a few more things to show.
All right, thank you, Q. So let's talk about maybe a couple more things, and then we'll finish off. I'll show you the end result of that restore process that we started earlier. But I want to talk about a general best practice guideline, and this is true regardless of whether you use Veeam or you use GroupWise Disaster Recovery or any other solution. But there's this concept of a 3-2-1 rule, and in a way, Q almost touched on it when you said that you could have multiple copies of your GroupWise environment using GroupWise Disaster Recovery. We talk about the same thing really from a broader perspective, the entire environment, that you should have at least 3 total copies of your environment. So the first one's your production copy, and then you would have 2 backup copies. That's how you have 3 different copies of your data on at least 2 different media. So you wouldn't want to, let's say, have your VMware environment on a SAN, back up that SAN, and then just carve out some separate space on that SAN to back itself right to itself. Then you're not on different media, you lose the SAN, you're still in trouble. So you'd want to at least be on 2 different media and have one of those be off-site. And again, someone asked her about, replicating to the cloud. That's an option, whether you use cloud or tape or anything. In fact, as an aside, I actually see a number of customers starting to adopt tape more, believe it or not, because of all the ransomware issues that have been going on. Because ultimately, if I have a backup sitting on tape and I've taken that tape out of a library or out of a tape drive, so it's completely offline, now there's no way for ransomware to infect those backups. So something to think about. You almost call it a 3-2-1-1 rule in that case, say one off-site and one of them completely offline versus cloud where it's still somewhat connected. And the other little part you see down towards the bottom right is that you should have 0 errors. So you could also look at it as a 3-2-1-0 rule, because it's not just good enough to take backups, you need to make sure that they're good. And that's something that we can help out with as far as automated testing. So it's a similar process as what I showed with Instant VM Recovery earlier, where we're going to spin up your VMs from the backup storage. In that case, it's assumed everything's running. You're not actually doing any kind of recovery. You just want to spin them up to be able to do some testing against them and then shut them back down. Things like, can we get VMware tools heartbeat? Can we ping the VM? Maybe you have some scripts that also try to connect to the application on specific ports. And the idea there is if there was corruption in your backup files, you're not going to get the OS to boot. Or even if somehow you did, you're definitely not going to be able to do that and get the application to respond properly. If all that's working, chances are your backup files are good. So that's what's really important with the 3-2-1 rule, and it doesn't lock you into anything specific from a technology standpoint, because again, it can leverage disk, it can leverage tape, it can leverage cloud, it could be backup jobs, it could be replication jobs, because a replica is another copy of your data. So there's a lot of different ways to implement this, and again, if you do some layering where you maybe use Veeam to do some of this, you've got GroupWise Disaster Recovery doing some of this, that really allows you to make sure that your GroupWise environment is highly available. And in fact, to try to adhere to this 3-2-1 rule, another way of doing it is to say, I have reload, GroupWise Disaster Recovery powered by reload, running in another location. So I've got that, I've got at least one backup copy. And then because that itself is a VM, then I use Veeam to back up that VM. That way, rather than having to use Veeam to back up the source GroupWise environment, where you still have to use those scripts to be able to shut services down and bring them back up in order to make certain that you've got a completely consistent backup. Use GWDR, since it'll allow you to do everything while GroupWise is online, right? Because it's leveraging DB copy and some other things under the hood. That means you don't have to shut down the agents at all. And then now that you've got this static offline copy without any open databases, then use Veeam to back up that. So you can bring the two together to really get you that 3-2-1 rule. And a couple other things that I'll mention too, more asides, but really kind of honing in the points that Q's made about what GWDR brings to the table when it comes to GroupWise, as far as the good reporting needs, doing incremental backups, reducing the amount of space that you need to use for protecting GroupWise itself. We bring that to the broader environment because we do similar strategies at the VM level. Incremental backups, so that way you don't have to go in and have large backup windows to say, oh, I've got to take a full backup of my VMware environment every night. Instead, we'll do incrementals. We've got inline dedupe, inline compression that will go ahead and reduce the amount of data that's out there. And then we've got a reporting solution called Veeam One that reports on not just Veeam backup and replication, but also VMware itself, or Hyper-V for that matter. So a lot of the things that you're hearing from both of us are similar messages. It's just, is it targeted at GroupWise, or is it targeted at more the rest of the environment? And bringing the two together really allows you to get that best availability as possible. So finally, just a couple of customer quotes, and you'll see the Noel name here that's mentioned. This is from a customer, so I didn't want to adjust it. Obviously, it'd be Micro Focus now, but he's with a school district in Wisconsin, and he mentioned, that he's brought Veeam into the environment, and even though he's got Micro Focus technologies, he also has things from Microsoft, and he's able to go ahead and make certain then that by using Veeam, he could protect anything in an environment and restore any of that, no matter what it might be. And then one other interesting quote, and this is actually from a customer that's over in Europe, is they switched from another solution over to Veeam and talked about just how easy we are to use, how fast we are, the integration with VMware. So again, preaching that best of breed approach from a performance aspect. So if you say I'm going to use Veeam for the environment and add in GWDR for the GroupWise piece, now you've got fast performance, you've got the best protection, and at the same time, simple UIs on both sides. Rather than trying to find one solution that maybe can do it all, even if the UI is a little kludgy, now you've got a couple of solutions that even though it's two, you can use them very efficiently. And then, I don't know, Q, if you've got anything to talk about as far as this, but I know this is another really awesome quote, in this case from one of your customers.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a situation where with T solicitors, they had a major flood in their organization, and obviously that flood, there was a lot that they had to deal with, but one of the things that they didn't have to worry about was their GroupWise system, because yes, it did affect, they had on-site servers and it affected their on-site GroupWise servers, but because of GroupWise disaster recovery, they were able to fail over to their off-site system, and they didn't they didn't have any downtime because they were able to fail over, and GroupWise ran on GroupWise disaster recovery, and they didn't lose even a single email because of those intraday backups. So this is a situation where they had that complete protection, being able to fail over and not losing that productivity, and then not losing any, not even one email. And of course, so now T-Solicitor swears by the solution, and we have many organizations that have would have similar success stories on being able to have those hot backups and being able to have failover.
Cool. That's a great story. So I guess what we'll say is, if you've got any questions, I mean, we're going to open this up to Q&A, and while we do that, I'll show this sort of the last part of the demo. But if you've got some more in-depth questions that want to follow up, I know there was a KVM question, so that might be a good offline discussion as far as how our agent-based approach can help in a KVM environment. Or if you want to see a demo of any of these things, a broader demo versus here where I've only showed you instant Veeam recovery, I mean, we're happy to do that. From a Veeam perspective, feel free to reach out to me, just joe.martin@veeam.com, very easy. And even if I'm not the SE that would cover you based upon where you're located, I will put you in touch with the right people. On the same token, if you've got some questions as far as GroupWise disaster recovery or would like to see a more in-depth demo of that, then Q is your contact there. See his email address, qmengus@microfocus.com. He can help you out with any of those, and again, put you in touch with the appropriate Micro Focus sales folks that can go into licensing aspects and things like that. So that being said, let me go ahead and pull up the rest of this demo. Oh, sorry for the little pop-up there. Let's pull up the rest of this demo here. So you can see where this at least finished off from a Veeam perspective. Because on the Veeam side, since all we're doing is running the VM, once the VM is booted and we see that, we'll say we're finished. And you can see here where we're not trying to do anything else. We just say we're waiting for you, Mr. User, to start migrating data and do whatever you need to with this instantly recovered VM. And at the same time, you can see where that VM, I should say, is fully booted and ready to go. So I could go ahead and, again, if I wanted to connect this to an isolated network, boot up, say, a Windows 10 VM with the GroupWise client, I could go ahead and grab data, archive it, and then copy that archive off. And finally, if I come out here to my vSphere client, no messages out there. I just see a running virtual machine. So to kind of finish this, I'm going to close this console because I'm going to end this process now and say, you know what, we've finished our recovery. So first of all, I'll just say finish. We're done there because all we did there was, like I said, do everything needed to boot that VM from the backup file. Notice here I've got a new thing that has showed up in the UI. This was not there earlier. This shows any instant recoveries currently that are ongoing, which there's only the one. So if I actually take a look at this guy, I've got a couple of options. One is migrate this to production. So I mentioned that earlier where we will migrate that VM. So that would be more of a case where you've actually lost the VM and need to get it back. In our case, we needed it just to be able to get into that VM, attach some or grab some data. We don't need it anymore. So I could say stop publishing. And so I will just do that. Stop publishing the VM. And again, I'm going to do a similar process, kind of have things side by side as I did earlier. We're going to watch, and you should see some messages start to appear on the right side where we basically power off the VM and then we unregister it. And there is nothing else to do. We don't have to delete it from a data store because there's nothing to delete. It was actually running from the backup files. So we'll see, did we move it anywhere? No, it's still where we originally created the restored object in. So you can see there where we're doing some of the pieces, unregister, some activity. Now I'll refresh this screen just because, again, this list doesn't update in the HTML5 based vSphere web client. But notice now that I hit refresh, it's out of there, completely unregistered, it's gone. It's as if it wasn't there, and I no longer even have that instant recovery option up here showing any instant recovery activity. So it is pretty simple to do things from the Veeam side, but again, if you want very specific GroupWise integrations, that's where it's a really awesome solution there if you add in GroupWise disaster recovery into the mix to be used along with Veeam. So with that, I'll pause. I don't know, Q, do you see any other questions that have come up?
I don't see any right now. If you have any questions, feel free to put those through. Obviously, if you have other in-depth questions, you can always reach out to us. Yeah, I don't see any at this time, Joe. But
okay.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your participation and for your questions and for being here. We're really glad we could bring this to you and hope you benefit from it.
Yeah, no, I enjoy being here. And again, any questions anyone might have, feel free to shoot me a note, shoot Q a note. We'll be happy to help you out.
Yep. Okay, thanks again, everybody, and look for that webinar recording. You'll get that shortly, and we'll see you on the next one.
All right. Thank you very much.